Welcome back to Mental Health Mondays, Imaginarium. So I got a question from one of my subscribers, Owen Rhodes. He's asking about the difference between mental illness and neurodivergence. Here he asks the question, is it possible that mental illness is a fashionable folk misunderstanding of neurodivergence? So the short answer to that question is not really. Mental illness is defined as a condition which causes suffering and poor adaptation to one's surroundings. It's easy to call this neurodivergence and say the suffering is just because they're not accepted. And there is some element of that here. But you can also see that some people simply struggle in social skills. For example, if we're talking about autistic spectrum disorder, not to blame them, but to claim that it's just neurodivergence means that there's nowhere to move forward for them to help with those skills. Not everybody has the same skill set coming into the world. So while I absolutely agree that we should widen our scope and take a look at folks who are neurodivergent and say maybe we need to adapt the way that we interact with them so that they can do better in life. What we don't want to do is cloud the issue and say that mental illness is really just neurodivergence, because although there are some fuzzy boundaries here, since culture changes, that's true, but there are connections to physiology and biology here that are important not to miss. This is very important here, because if you don't have that link to physiology and biology, then all of this stuff just sort of becomes an abstract exercise in culturally constructed definitions, and it starts to get extremely murky. So what is a mental illness then? Well, a mental illness is when our normal adaptive responses are not working specifically and precisely enough in a more or less long-term way. And that's generally what mental illness is. There are some exceptions to that. Here's another question from Owen. Okay, that's a follow-up question. How do we know what is a mental disorder inherited genetically, or what is a complex which forms as a result of pressure from the ego or pressure on the ego that the ego can't handle? Are there different approaches needed to heal or manage a mental illness versus a complex? Because if a complex functions like a mental illness, which is theoretically possible given that complexes have autonomy and on a physiological level, how do we even tell the difference, and what does that difference even matter? Okay, so there's a lot to untangle here and unpack. First of all, I think it's a little bit too simple. Okay, it's a lot too simple to just say things are either inherited or they are a complex. That's a false dichotomy. That may not be what Owen is really implying here, but it's what jumps out at me immediately about this question. What we inherit are really predispositions to certain problems, but it still takes the right conditions to manifest them. And this is true of all your mental disorders. Even things like PTSD, which is one of the few mental illnesses defined with a cause in mind. Most of the mental illnesses that are defined in, say, the DSM-5 are lists of symptoms, i.e. they are syndromes. This is not unusual in medicine in general. And in order to facilitate easier communication among practitioners, they decided to go with a theory-neutral approach. That means that theory can add to the discussion here, but it is not necessarily baked into the descriptions of the mental illnesses we have, like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder and so forth and so on. Before this change was made in the older versions of the DSM, the terminology was entangled with the theory that it was coming from, and that led to a lot of confusion. Okay, so now, well, how does that relate to complexes? So a complex is a way of describing someone's suffering that can be used in addition to the mental illness criteria that we're using. They are related, but they're not identical. A complex is a normal response that happens in reaction to trauma, where you get an emotional subpersonality developing that can sometimes resurface and cause problems. Correspondingly, the resolution of a complex can help cause a remission of the symptoms that may be recognized as part of a mental illness syndrome. Now, the final question that Owen brings up is about bipolar disorder. I think that's what he's really getting at here, is what's the difference between a bipolar mania and an inflated ego complex? So, bipolar disorder manifests as an extreme of normal inflation. So, a mania is an inflated state plus a lot. Okay, so on the inflation scale, that's like cranking it up to 11, as it were. And the symptoms there, you go for days without sleep. You talk a mile a minute, you think a mile a minute. Nobody can keep up with your thoughts because they're very scattered, and you have what's called a flight of ideas. You might have grandiose ideas. Folks that I've interacted with bipolar disorder often have religious delusions. They have delusions that they are connected to famous people, that they have millions of dollars, and so forth and so on. So that's, as you can see, a little bit more than your typical ego inflation. The ego inflation is something that happens to everybody, and that's more in the so-called normal range. But when you get that bad, then that's mania, and that's bipolar disorder. Okay, so another difference here between, say, bipolar disorder and a manic phase of a bipolar disorder versus an ego-inflated complex is that, again, complexes are defined as having been responses in relation to some kind of trauma, typically. Whereas bipolar mania can emerge in either a trauma that wouldn't normally do that to anyone else, a mild trauma, say like a short family separation. You can see this in a first break of folks who are going to college for the first time. I often saw that in the student clinic when I worked there. Military training, you can see a first break then. These are things that don't normally make people manic. But if you have the biological predisposition, then you're going to be more vulnerable to that. And so saying it's related to a trauma is pushing the definition a little bit. Not to mention the fact that the relationship of the trauma to the response is out of proportion. So a mania is when you're basically just going off the rails completely, such that the normal homeostatic mechanisms that we talk about in the mind can't keep up with it without help of therapy, medications, and lifestyle changes. So one way is to do, as far as like the main question here, one way is to tell the differences between the symptoms, and the other one has to do with dreams and fantasies, which are going to be qualitatively different in an ego-inflated state versus a manic state. It's typically a difference of degree. Patients that are manic or getting ready to go into a manic phase will often have dreams that have lots of dismemberment and blood and gore and violence and things like that. Whereas in an ego-inflated state, where you're basically more or less being pressured by a complex more often, on an extended period, you will have dreams that are more subtle here. There won't be so much carnage and mayhem and destruction of the ego in imagery that the psyche is seeing, the homeostatic mechanism is seeing. So I hope that answers your questions. That's what I've got for you today on Mental Health Mondays here at the Imaginarium. So click the like button, subscribe, go on to ericgoodwyn.com, sign up for the newsletter, and I will see you next time. Later, gang.